Welcome to Lesson 15 of our survey on Genesis. This is part 2 of our lesson series of lessons that we have on Jacob, titled Chickens Come Home to Roost, Part 2. If you didn't see the lesson from last week, I encourage you to check it out, because obviously Part 1, Part 2, we're going to build off of what we did last week. But I'll remind you of maybe a cartoon that you saw in that last lesson, this cartoon that says, this guy says, "Well, I hope you're happy, Muriel. They're home and they're ready to roost." And of course, that saying, "the chickens come home to roost," is an idiom that you may have heard for what goes around comes around, or there are consequences for decisions that we make. And so this notion that the chickens eventually will come home to roost is certainly part of Jacob's story. And I'll remind you, like we did last lesson, some patterns to watch out for with Jacob as we think about his story and the journey that we're going to see him, literally journey that we're going to see him taking, that, at least from our perspective and what we see from the biblical account, that it seems like Jacob tends to be passive rather than proactive. He tends to proceed, as we often do, from a human rather than a godly perspective when making decisions, especially really important decisions. He tends to trust in temporal power and wealth rather than godly power. And he complains a lot about these roosting chickens. When he's on the sort of giving side of deceit or trickery, that's one thing. When he's on the receiving side, he's often complaining, rather than thinking about, is there something here that I should be learning from my experience? So we're going to find out across this series of lessons, and in fact, really through the end of Genesis, that in many ways Jacob is a flawed man. He's a flawed husband. He's a flawed father. But we'll also find that Jacob has a heart for God. And that because of his heart and the way that God is able to see him, God continues to work in Jacob's life. He continues to bless Jacob. He continues to have a place for Jacob in his perfect plan. And in many respects, God is able to work his perfect plan despite some of the decisions that Jacob makes. And of course, that's very comforting to us to know that God is able to work through us, and in some cases, despite us. So we're going to dive into the lesson. We're going to first look at the context. Where is Jacob on his life journey? Last lesson, he was age 77 when he got married. And of course, the end of this lesson, we will have gone through 7 years for him to marry Leah and Jacob. And then, of course, he promises another 7 years to Laban. So at the end of the lesson, we're going to see him at age 91. And I made the point last time that, as far as chickens go, Jacob's no spring chicken, right? So it turns out that Leah and Rachel are going to have a man who's, given the life expectancies of this time, certainly, midway through his life. And so, you may, as I did, have this perception that a young Jacob is going off to get married to a young Rachel and Leah, but, at 84 years old, we're not going to say that Jacob is young. So it's something to keep in mind as the story unfolds. Does his life stage have anything to do with his decision making? Does the fact that he spent, 70 years in mom and dad's, tent area have anything to do with how he makes decisions? So just something to keep in mind. Context is important. And then the last bit of context is that when we started out Jacob's story, he's down here with mom and dad, Rebekah and Isaac. And of course, Isaac sent him up to get a wife. So he traveled the journey all the way up to Haran. It's over 500 miles. And this is where he is now. Even though he has not only one wife, he has two. Rather than journeying back as his father's servant did with Isaac's wife, he's up here hanging out with Laban and his brothers-in-law in Haran. And that's obviously going to impact the story of Jacob as that unfolds. So he's far from home. He's far from the influence of his godly parents and his godly grandparents for his children. His sons and daughters that are going to be born to him get Grandpa Laban and their scheming uncles as their role models, rather than having Isaac and Rebekah as their role models, which is great. great setup for raising a young family. So let's jump right into our scripture. So we're going to be in Genesis 29 just to pick up where we left off, and then we're going to move quickly into chapter 30. Just a reminder, this scripture tells the story of Laban pulling a bait and switch tactic with Jacob, and he subs Leah in for Rachel after that big wedding feast when Jacob was probably not in the best frame of mind to be making important decisions or evaluating things. But Jacob takes the bait, and rather than head back to Canaan with his new wife Leah, which was a choice that he had, right? He could have chosen to say, I have my wife as my father sent me to do, and I'm going to head back to home, which is probably what he should have done. He takes the bait and signs up for 7 more years of working for Laban. So he's 84 years old now. He's going to be 91 by the time he finishes that commitment. And he signs up for 7 more years with the commitment from Laban that he gets Rachel now. So he's going to be married to Leah for a week, and then they're going to have another wedding, and he's going to have Rachel. So he had the choice, potentially, to avoid a lifetime of pain and suffering and implications for his family by heading back with his wife. And then he has another choice here in this passage. First off, he could have said, I'll be married to Leah for 7 years and work for Rachel and take Rachel in 7 years. I understand that's putting off the thing that he really wanted the most, and we as humans have a tendency not to want to put off things that we want. But even with the way that this set up, with him being married to both Rachel and Leah, Jacob has a choice at this point to love these 2 women in an Ephesians 5 kind of way. And to be honest, I don't know how that would work, but he had the choice to at least try. And instead of doing that, it seems that he doesn't even try, and in fact, he makes the choice to love Rachel more than Leah. Surely that would be evident to everyone around, that he loves Rachel more than Leah. And it would be really evident to Leah that she's not the favored one. In fact, that there's probably a lot of bad feelings that are undeserving for her because Laban's the one that manipulated the situation, but probably Jacob resents Leah for the way things turned out. And so because of this, you have to think, what impact is that going to have on his family? And what kind of father is Laban when he's going to do this to his 2 daughters? He's going to put them in this situation. He's an awful father. And so we have obviously lessons to learn there about how we care for our family and we don't do things that are manipulative. And honestly, this should have been some kind of last straw event for Jacob, right? But we'll see that it takes a lot more straws to break the camel's back in this situation, and that it's going to be a while before Jacob finally does the right thing and heads back for his promised land and takes up his role in his family. So now we're going to see what happens in this situation where Jacob's got these 2 wives and their 2 handmaids. So interestingly, this is the first time since Jacob showed up in Haran that the scriptures actually show God explicitly working in this situation. Jacob showed up at the well. Everything is unfolded at this point without the scripture saying that God is doing anything. Obviously, he may be very active, but this explicitly says that Yahweh, and remember, all caps Lord, is God's formal name, so it's Yahweh, is going to be at work. And I'm not sure if Leah and Rachel in this whole situation really understand the nature of their protector, that Yahweh is looking after them. It seems as if they do call on his name, that they pray to him, but we also know that they've got their heathen culture and the idols and all that in the mix. So they may not know really who's looking out for them and who's answering their prayers. But the other thing that's interesting is for this entire 7-year period, there's really nothing said about Jacob's relationship with God or God working in Jacob's life. And now we're going to see God working in the lives of Rachel and Leah. And just watch and see where you see the scriptures explicitly talking about Jacob and his relationship with God and God working in his life. What we'll see is that God sees the situation that Leah has and that she's not preferred. And so he blesses her. He blesses her with 4 sons in very quick succession. So you've got Reuben, the firstborn, and then you've got Simeon, the second, Levi, the third, and Judah, the fourth-born son, all from Leah in a very quick period of time. Because remember, all of the sons except for Benjamin are going to be born in a 7-year period. So there's a lot of babies in the tent. Also notice that consistently this is going to follow the Hebrew tradition of having names provided that have an underlying meaning. And so every time that Leah names a son, she's going to give him a name that has something to do with her condition, right? So Reuben is named because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. And then you can see the names for Simeon, Levi, and Judah. This time I will praise the Lord, instead of thinking about what Isaac thinks, maybe. So all of them are going to have meanings that you'll notice as the sons are named. It's interesting to think about Judah being the fourth-born son, and that from Judah's line is going to come the kingly succession with David and ultimately Jesus Christ. And we'll have to wait for another lesson to find out why Reuben and Simeon and Levi might not be qualified to have that role. We'll also have to wait for another lesson to see why Judah is qualified despite some of the decisions that he makes. But what we can take away is that God is able to work his plan regardless of things that we may think are important, like birth order. So Rachel's watching all this happen. 4 sons born. No sons are born to her. And so she takes a page out of Sarah's playbook, if you remember, from Sarah and Abraham. And Sarah says, look, I'm just not going to have any children. I'm too old, so I'm going to give you my handmaid as a wife. Well, she takes a page out of that playbook and provides Jacob with a third wife, which seems like a really bad solution to the problem, right? Another wife. And it seems like, to me, Jacob has a choice in the matter too, right? That Jacob has an opportunity to stand up here and say, no, that's not the way we're going to do things. Instead, he responds with emotion. It says his anger was kindled against Rachel because she's holding him responsible somehow for the fact that she's not having any children. And he says, look, it's clearly not my fault. I've got 4 sons with Leah. This is between you and God. So I don't know why you're bringing me into it. So clearly friction in the marriage. They probably should use some counseling services, like from a Dave Stevens type person, maybe, to help in their situation. But there's friction and there's emotion, and Jacob seems to respond from emotion instead of the way he should respond, which is to think about this choice that he has and whether he wants to add a third element to what's already a really complicated situation. But just as his tendency seems to be, he's passive in this decision, and he says, okay, great, I'll go along with the plan. He could have counseled Rachel and said, we need to trust in God. It's only been, 3-4 years. He could have helped her understand how God works in people's lives. He could have helped her understand that her value as a woman isn't tied to how many children that she provides to Jacob, and just loved her regardless. But none of those things happen. And so Jacob feeds into this friction, this rivalry that's happening with his decision. Also, we have to understand that it's common, obviously, with Abraham and Sarah. They were taking cues from their culture. It was common for a man to have not only his wife, but concubines and handmaidens and multiple wives, obviously. But God's people are called to be countercultural, and there's a decision here that Jacob could have made that would have been countercultural, but still would have been the better decision. And so what happens is that the friction between Jacob and Rachel is there. The honeymoon's clearly over. And there's also friction, obviously, building between the 2 sisters. So Jacob goes along with the plan. 2 more sons are born. And notice that it says they're born to Rachel. So I'm not sure exactly what happens to Bilhah's status as a wife. It's not Bilhah's children. They're credited to Rachel. So Rachel has children through her surrogate. And how would you like to be poor Naphtali, right? So Naphtali gets, a name that is really indicative of the strife between the 2 sisters. So he's tagged with that for the rest of his life, a reminder that his birth comes out of that kind of dysfunction and friction. At least Gad and Asher end up with better names. And Gad and Asher come from Leah's handmaid. So Leah stops having children, and so she offers up her handmaid as a fourth wife. And once again, Joseph kind of goes along with that. So now you have Joseph, 4 wives, and a growing set of preteen and toddlers running around. Sounds like it could be a stressful environment. And then we have this really interesting story in the middle of chapter 30 about these mandrakes. And if you've read this and remember, there's this exchange that happens. Apparently, mandrakes have or had some mystical connection with human fertility. From what I read, it has to do with the appearance of the mandrake, which it kind of looks like a stick figure of a human. And so as people were harvesting these mandrakes, they noticed the resemblance, and then they made some connection to say, hey, if we eat these things, maybe just like human-like things are growing in the earth, it'll enhance our fertility. So that is apparently the reason for them wanting the mandrakes. And it may explain why Rachel would want to bargain for them, right? If I eat these mandrakes, then I'm going to be able to have children. So there's this bargain that's struck up, right? And it's because the friction between the sisters is escalating, and it's a full-on rivalry. And so Leah bargains with Rachel to say, I'll give you these mandrakes in exchange for time with my husband. So I'm going to effectively strike up a bargain to hire my husband. She walks up to Jacob. She says, you must come with me because I've hired you with my son's mandrakes. So once again, there's an opportunity for Jacob to stand up and say, that's ridiculous. Mandrakes have no power. Here's what we should do. We should be praying to God for children if that's what you want. And it's not appropriate for you to hire me to do something. In fact, we kind of have a word for that, right? Somebody who's hired for sex. So this is a really complicated and weird situation. And once again, Jacob puts himself in a place where he's passively agreeing to something that's just weird and inappropriate. But it is interesting that it says God listened to Leah. So this desire that she has to have a place in Jacob's family, to be blessed, God listens to that request and blesses her with another son, Issachar. And then a 6th son. So she's got 6 between her and her handmaid. And Leah will be done providing sons to Jacob, but she will provide a daughter. And her name is Dinah. And we'll have her in a future lesson, which is a tragic lesson, actually. But one girl in the family. And it's interesting to me that if you actually look at a lot of charts of Jacob's children, they're called Jacob's children, that you'll see 12 sons and no mention of the daughter, which I think is tragic because Dinah has a place in the family and a place in the story. And I would think, being the only daughter, she would be the princess in the family, right? Probably spoiled rotten. I have no idea. But at any rate, later we're going to see how well her family protects her in a situation that puts her in danger. And then finally, from Rachel's perspective, because it's still, we're talking about a 7-year period, right? This isn't Sarah, waiting for years and years and decades. This is a relatively short period of time, but finally, God remembers Rachel. God listened to her, opened her womb. She conceives and has her firstborn son, firstborn son, Joseph. And Joseph's name says, "May the Lord add to me another son." So one's not going to be enough for Rachel. And Joseph's whole name indicates that enough is not enough, right? He's not enough. And maybe that has something to do with the way that Joseph acts within the family. Who knows? We'll have to see. Let's look at the family chart and see what that looks like when we come back. Well, it's an interesting family tree. So, unlike his father Isaac with the two sons, Jacob is going to have a very large family. You see Leah with her natural-born sons plus the two from Zilpah. You see Rachel with Joseph, and then the two sons from Bilhah. We're still missing one. Benjamin's going to come later to fill out the 12 sons, and then the daughter Dinah. You look at that family tree, and you think about that family tree from the perspective of the ancients and what they would have thought about Jacob and his family. And there's a sort of a worldly perspective on this, right? So first off, if you look at this family and you say 12 sons, wow, this man must be exceptionally blessed. He's got more than a football team here. He's got plenty of guys that are going to be able to grow up and help in the family enterprise. So he's not going to have all the hired hands that he probably has right now. In fact, his hired hands are his brothers-in-law, which is another part of the story. But ultimately, he's going to have all of these sons to really be helping, and so that must mean that God's blessing him, right? He's got all these sons. That's the natural conclusion you'd come from. Oh, he's got 4 wives. Lucky guy, right? He must be really, really blessed. As the only daughter, Dinah, surely she's going to fetch an amazing bride price, right? She should be the princess, and when it's time for her to marry off, somebody's going to have to pay a premium for her. And in fact, that's actually part of Dinah's story when we get to it. But from a worldly perspective, you would look at this situation and say, what a great starting point. What an enterprise that Jacob can establish. Surely this is a dynasty in the making, right? Or is it slaves in the making? There's a spiritual reality within Jacob's family. Under the covers of the family tree with all of the apparent blessings, you've got rivalry among the wives. I would assume among all 4 of them. Not only between Rachel and Leah, but because of the status of Zilpah and Bilhah, that they're wives, but they're handmaids, and their children are credited to their mistresses as well. There's got to be some friction there, I would think. The stage is certainly set in this whole situation for sibling rivalry, which we're going to see how that plays out. Under the covers, you see a man who seems very passive and at the mercy of the family dynamics that are swirling around him. What's Jacob praying for? We have no idea, right? We don't hear him looking to God for answers. I'm not saying that he didn't, but we don't see that in the story. So the impression that we get is somebody who's just kind of rolling along with life, and these dynamics around him or he's at the mercy of them. He has a conniving father-in-law that's not done sabotaging his daughters and his son-in-law and his grandchildren. And the family, we're going to find out later, is holding on to their idols. And they're holding on to the heathen culture of deceit that they live within. And so because they haven't headed back to the promised land, they're living in this culture that's having an impact on all these young sons and on how they interact. And that influence is going to carry on really throughout the experience of this family. And so you might ask the question, with that spiritual reality, how can God possibly work through this mess? This is going to end up being a really messy situation. So how can God work through this mess? Surely he needs to move on to somebody else. But we're going to see that that's not how God works. That's not how he works in Jacob's life. Maybe, and we don't know, but maybe God or Jacob is actually maintaining a relationship with God and praying to God. And we're actually going to see, at least maybe in a kind of an awkward way, that Jacob may be praying for something in how the story unfolds here. He seems to come to his senses as we move through chapter 30 and comes to the conclusion that now Joseph is born, and maybe there's a connection there. But now that Joseph is born, it's time to head back to the promised land. It's time to head back to maybe the protection and nurture of Isaac and Rebekah now that he's got a favored son. But whatever the motive, he comes to the conclusion that it's time to head back. And Laban, in response, as Jacob goes to Laban and says, it's time for me to head home, Laban proposes a breakup fee. It's not enough that Jacob's worked 14 years for him and has created an amazing result for Laban. Laban says, well, what should I pay you in order for you to leave? Or what exchange should happen between us in order for you to head back? So Jacob responds appropriately in the passage. Laban says, look, I've learned by divination that Yahweh has blessed me. So somehow Laban has received the message that Yahweh is behind all these blessings. That's good, right? It's not good to use divination, but nevertheless, he knows that Yahweh is the source of these blessings. So at least he gives credit where credit is due. And Jacob does too, right? He says, you had little before I came, and it's increased abundantly, and Yahweh has blessed you wherever I turned. But now you're going to make me also provide for my household that I have, my children and my wives and my sheep. And so rather than actually negotiate appropriately and say, look, I have what I have, and I'm going to go, or frankly, hey, I'm going to take a little and leave you with a lot, and then reestablish my presence in the promised land. He negotiates poorly and signs up for a scheme. And he proposes to Laban that, look, I'll take all of the non-pristine sheep, right? There's the white sheep, and then there's the ones that have speckles, or they have they're black sheep or stripes or whatever. So the ones that are speckled or spotted or black, I'll take them, and you can have all of the really pretty sheep, and we'll call it even. And I'll stay and I'll continue to help you with your flocks, which is probably the most important thing. Is he's going to continue to grow his sons up in that culture. Maybe he's just distracted by 11 preteen sons that are running around the tent. Maybe it seems like actually a good idea to hang out a little bit longer instead of taking a bunch of young children on a 500-mile journey. It makes you wonder who's watching the flocks, right? No, his sons aren't watching the flocks. They're too young. And that means that most likely it's the brothers-in-law that are actually watching the flocks. And you would think that if Jacob's going to make this kind of bargain, that he would at least have some idea of how many of the sheep in the flocks are speckled or spotted or black, right? But maybe he doesn't. Maybe he's hands off as far as the flock's concerned, and the uncles really know, his brothers-in-law really know, what the inventory looks like. So I don't know, but he's certainly at the mercy of those hired hands. And so the question is, what's he going to do, right? So Laban really pulls a trick on him, and that very day pulls all of those sheep, the speckled and the spotted and the black ones, out of the flock and moves them a 3 days journey and puts them under the oversight of his sons. And so when Jacob shows up to manage the flock, they're all pristine, they're all white. And so it would seem like his plan is foiled because the DNA is not in the flock to produce more speckled, spotted, and black sheep. So there's this interesting story about what Jacob does about the problem. He doesn't pray to God to intervene. He doesn't confront Laban and say, where did all the speckled and black sheep go? Instead, he has this really interesting approach, which I interpret as kind of a prayer. There may be, I couldn't find any reference to anything about poplar sticks and almond sticks and plane trees and peeling them and exposing the white, having anything to do with breeding technique or anything like that. So I'm interpreting this as that Jacob's looking for an outcome, and he's got an illustration to provide. The illustration is here's the kind of sticks that are striped and speckled and spotted, and this is the kind of sheep that I want, so I'm going to lay them out when they come to water, and it's a request that sheep are produced in line with this, a kind of a prayer. Because otherwise I don't know what necessarily breeding technique that's really going on here that's going to have any real impact. So whatever his intent or understanding was, it works. That spotted and speckled and black sheep start being produced. Now, maybe there's actually some DNA there that is coming to the forefront, but nevertheless, Jacob does ultimately seem to know about selective breeding. That when you start to get the kind of sheep that you want, that they have the coloration that you want, and then you start to look and see the ones that are healthy and strong, then you put those together, and you're going to have more speckled and spotted and black sheep that are healthy and strong. And you can start to separate the weaker sheep and the white sheep and selectively breed your flock, which is what he does over the time that he's here, about 6 years, to get a really nice, big, healthy, spotted, speckled black sheep flock. And possibly in this same amount of time, these sons are growing up. So the oldest may be 7 or 8 at the starting point after 6 years. Then they're 13, 14, which is adult age in the ancient times. So now maybe he's getting some help from some of his sons with the herding duties, which would be great. But we're going to find out that the plan definitely isn't working out from Laban's perspective. So Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, Jacob's taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's, he has gained all his wealth. Well, technically that's true. He's gained all his wealth from the starting point that was Laban's. But it's really interesting that after 6 years, when the sons pulled the trick and really stole Jacob's wealth by removing all of the spotted, speckled, and black sheep, that now they're complaining about the fact that the tables seem to have turned. Maybe they're not recognizing who's turning the tables. But finally, after all this time of Jacob being in Haran, we actually see God explicitly intervening with Jacob. Yahweh said to Jacob, "Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you." So, the Lord has spoken. Yahweh's telling Jacob, look, if not before now is the time for sure for you to go home. And then he gives him an amazing promise, another amazing promise, right? That I'll be with you. It's not the first time that he said it. And so with that kind of promise, with that command, with that direction, with that promise that I'll be with you, you would expect Jacob to be decisive, right? To say, all right, that's it. Pack up the tents. We're headed home. Well, he starts to make a move towards home. But we're going to see in our lesson next week that Jacob isn't as decisive as you would expect him to be in this situation. And it, once again, complicates his life. But at least he's headed in the right direction. He's headed to the promised land. And he and God are going to continue to wrestle over Jacob's situation. So what takeaways can we have from this lesson? It's a difficult lesson, honestly. Dysfunctional family, sibling rivalry, rivalry between 4 different wives, friction within the marriage. It's really messy. But as in all biblical lessons for us, there's things that we can learn, right? The first ones are ones that I had from last week, that we should not presume that man's way is God's way. Jacob over and over takes a very human perspective, a superficial perspective, even maybe just throwing up a wish by putting sticks in front of the sheep or some sort of prayer. But nevertheless, we shouldn't presume that man's way is God's way. And we should know that God will work his plan with us if we are cooperative and allow him and ask him to do that. And he may work through us, which is awesome. He may work despite us if we're making bad choices. We can learn from the successes and failures of those who precede us, certainly from somebody like Jacob or Isaac or Joseph or all of our Bible heroes. But even in this life, we can observe what's going on around us and learn from people that we may look up to, or just people we're observing who make decisions. And we can see that often human perspective is superficial, and we're making decisions based on what we see on the surface, but a godly perspective is spiritual. To have a godly perspective, we need wisdom. And we're told to pray for wisdom, that we can ask God specifically to give us wisdom, and that he'll grant that request. And then you can use that wisdom to make godly decisions. Making godly decisions often requires us to allow God to work, right? To ask him to work in a situation, to give us answers, to open doors. And sometimes that requires us to take time, right? That sometimes the best decision is to not make a decision and wait on the Lord. Sometimes the absolute best decision is to retreat, to step back. Jesus did that. Jesus stepped back. He retreated. He went to the top of the mountain and prayed. He didn't always step into conflict. Sometimes he stepped away from conflict. It would be nice for Jacob to step into conflict more than he does. But there are times when he was faced with a decision that he seems to make a snap decision when retreat would have been the best decision. No, you know what? You guys work this out. I'm not going to take a handmaid as a wife. But that's not the way it's going to go. If an open door or a call in our life is obvious, and it should be obvious to us when the Spirit is leading us, right, that there's an opportunity here, then we should be decisive in our response. We should be decisive in our response with worship and with gratitude and with credit where credit is due, which is to God. And then let God do the work for whatever He has in mind for us to do. And then, unfortunately, this series of lessons are going to continue to remind us that chickens do come home to roost, that there are consequences for mistakes. Jacob makes a lot of them, and there's good lessons for us to learn there. But as I said last week, the main lesson is that God is willing to work in that dysfunction. He's able to work in that dysfunction. He's able to redeem even in situations that don't seem to have the potential for redemption. And we're going to see that happen over and over again. And it gives us hope for our lives that can often be filled with dysfunction and friction. And especially at this time of year when people are getting together, often there's friction and challenge. And if that's happening in your family, I would encourage you to just step back, be still, and know that God is there at work, and pray for wisdom. Hope you have an amazing holiday period. Looking forward to the next 2 lessons. And until then, if you would read Genesis 31, we'll be prepared for the next lesson.